theories of happiness are somehow less troubled by the misfortunes of the deserving than by all those people who are happy and couldn't possibly be. I wanted to start this video off with a quote because it says a lot. Many people think through happiness by observing other people, and essentially they usually are thinking about happiness in relation to situations in which people are happy in which most people wouldn't be, or maybe even really shouldn't be. And by that I mean, like, people often talk about those who are happy even though they are in poverty, or people who are happy even though they've experienced devastating loss. But as the quote kind of implies, people don't really ever talk about people who are unhappy and are rightfully unhappy because of situations, like the person who's unhappy that they're in poverty and is rightfully unhappy because they're suffering, or the person who's, experienced great loss and is told to look on the bright side. They're not going to be able to do that. The unhappy deserve happiness, but they also don't deserve misfortune to get happiness, if that makes sense. However, life doesn't seem to always work that way. It really never works that way. People usually are going to have to suffer, and, you're going to feel unhappy several times in your life. And this is because, that's just the nature of reality. Unhappiness is a real thing. And we don't let people acknowledge their own suffering at times. And what I mean by this is when someone's around another person who is expressing discomfort or unhappiness, people usually get angry at that person or express their own discomfort towards this other person's unhappiness. The unhappy ruin the mood for happy people, usually, or how we socially understand society today. The unhappy often remind the happy of their own suffering, which makes the unhappy, seem like the bad person, if that makes sense. And this is understandable, in the sense that, like, if you're unhappy, you're unhappy. And it's also somewhat understandable in the sense for the happy or the happy people to not exactly want to be around the unhappy people and want them to not express that emotion. But when one deals with unhappiness, or dare I say despair, on their own, it can lead to bad life choices, or even death in a lot of cases. So you can't just force someone to bottle up their unhappiness just because you're happy and they're not, and you don't want to hear about that. But the question is, what do we do about people who are unhappy, and how do you assist them without, falling into unhappiness yourself or suffering in a situation? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a psychologist. I've taken a few psychology classes, but that means nothing in the grand scheme of anything. But I'm sure, like 100% sure in the fact that, like, it is bad to force someone to bottle up an emotion. And unhappiness, is not an emotion itself, but it refers to a range of emotions. Like I said, despair, sadness, hopelessness, nihilism, emptiness, anything like that. And as we know, like, bottling those things up is bad. Bottling up emotions can lead one to explode or implode emotionally. But I'm not sure what to do about this. I'm not sure how to help people be happier, or how to force the unhappy to be happy, if that's even a good thing to do, which I really am not sure if it is. You should feel the breadth of your emotions. And if that is unhappiness, you need to feel the breadth of that unhappiness, or else you'll never fully deal with it. But again, I'm not sure how to deal with this, You want to help the unhappy without forcing the unhappy to become happy, in a sense, so they can feel that emotion. but you also don't want to become unhappy yourself, because that can cause some problems in and of itself, that now you have an emotion you have to deal with, and the catalyst was this other unhappy person. And Richardson's quote that I just read, doesn't give the answer either. He just says two other strange quotes that seem to all relate to this first quote. I say nothing works anymore, but I get up and it's tomorrow. Success is whatever humiliation everyone has agreed to compete for. At first, these quotes seem like the regular old rise and grind style quotes, but then you realize that they aren't. The first quote almost seems to imply that one will suffer, but they have to get up and keep going, rise and grind, the standard capitalistic metaphor. Nah, it's not a metaphor. I'm losing what it really is right now. Figurative language. Anyway, the concept of rise and grind is a very capitalistic sentiment that tells one to just keep working, regardless of suffering. But this is not really what the first quote is saying. The first quote, at least to me, implies that suffering is natural, like the rise and grind quote does. But failure does not last forever. One day you will wake up and you will not be suffering anymore, and that is beautiful. One day you'll wake up and it's tomorrow. The suffering has ended. Meanwhile, the second quote is so antithetical to how most people view the world that it's really interesting to me. Richardson is attacking the concept of success in this quote, at least based on my interpretation. Richardson is stating that success is just a competition that one seems to agree to or fight for socially. It's a social contract in a sense. This implies that success is about winning. Success is not really about anything but winning. It's a competition. And success, according to this quote, implies that it's not about living. To live is to wake up tomorrow, like the first quote implies. To live is to suffer and to also not suffer. To succeed is to win some prize in a social environment, or to win some social prize, whether that's fame, money, recognition, worship, anything along those lines, That's what success is, but that's not what living is. Competition can be healthy. It can be beautiful. Healthy competition is beautiful inherently. But success is not what life is. Accomplishing is not what life is. It's a small part of life. Life, as I've stated earlier, is waking up tomorrow. It's experiencing the suffering today, and knowing you won't experience the suffering tomorrow, and experiencing something new. It's experiencing today and waking up and experiencing tomorrow, and so on and so forth. Life is about experiencing the next thing, the next day, the next situation, the next meal. It's not about accomplishing or succeeding. Those add to the experience. But somehow we flipped them into making it seem like success is life, and experience leads to success, instead of success being a part of experience. Men observe when things hit and not when they miss, and forget and pass over the other. Now, this is a quote from Francis Bacon, and this quote is really odd. It was odd the first time I read it, and it's odd now, because in my mind, people remember when they fail as much as they remember their wins. Both take up equal space in one's mind, usually, at least from my experience. It's a little anecdotal. I don't have much research to back that up, but it seems that is the case. The way athletes and champions and people who have success talk about their successes and their failures. They usually think about both a lot. However, the way I interpret the quote now, the quote is possibly talking about science, patterns, and problem solving. Those who don't know, Francis Bacon is a scientist, an old scientist from a long time ago, who made great contributions to the field of science and the field of philosophy in many regards. And Francis Bacon, in my current opinion, is saying that people remember more about when they can solve a puzzle, and that overshadows their failed attempts to solve a puzzle. And this includes like science, like, the scientific method kind of works like a puzzle, like you're piecing together the correct answer to something. But again, this is my interpretation, and I can't stress that this is my interpretation enough, because Bacon's work, or the quote that this comes from out of Bacon's work, is a text called the Silva Silvarium. Probably butchered that. I don't speak the language this is coming from. But Silva is a mystery to most scholars, especially like Bacon scholars, like people who study Francis Bacon and his works, because the work is very incoherent and was published after Bacon's death and is vastly different from all of Francis Bacon's other writings, and scholars have tried to piece together what the Silva means and, what quotes like the one I just shared mean, but they fail to piece together what Bacon's work means. It's not like his other books. What is the reason behind this incoherent scattering of what some people assume to be laboratory notes, or other people assume that it's incoherent because it wasn't meant to be published. It was published after Bacon's death by his writer and chaplain, Dr. William Rowley, who wrote in the preface of the original publication that the book was meant to be published and Bacon wanted it to be incoherent. A lot of scholars don't believe that. Some scholars do believe that, because why would he lie? Regardless, the work, the Silva Silvarum, I'm gonna butcher it every time, is incoherent. And it might be supposed to be incoherent, it might not supposed to be incoherent, and Bacon didn't want people to see it. Either way, people are looking for some type of genius behind Bacon's quotes in this text. Just like the quote I just mentioned, that kind of is weird, and I can't fully understand the context behind it, because the Silva, which I have not read in full, I really haven't read it all, I've just skimmed some of it. I've seen the quote before in a book that's one of my sources in the comments. It's a book of different personal essays, quotes Francis Bacon, and I pulled the quote from that. And then did research into the Silva, and the work makes no sense. I thought I'd read the first few pages, I thought I was tripping, and then I did some research and read some scholarly articles, and scholars were like, nope, we don't know what this means. That aside, essentially scholars are trying to find meaning in the work, and that kind of relates to how I'm interpreting Bacon's quote. People are searching for meaning, and they're failing to do so. They haven't hit the nail on the head. So they're caught up in all their failures, even though if they were to succeed and figure out the meaning of Bacon's, Silva, that would overshadow all their failures beforehand. It'll just be roped into the story of the success. Like Bacon said, you remember when you hit rather than when you miss, because the misses kind of fold into the hits, as I'm interpreting the work now. But no one can really hit the nail on the head, because Bacon is dead. So you'll never really get the answers. You'll just keep trying to piece it together. And scholars will continuously either ignore the Silva and just focus on Bacon's other works, or obsess over the Silva, trying to figure out what it is, what it means. And they'll ignore, all of what is happening around the Silva. And whether Bacon wanted the work to be published or not, whether Bacon has a hidden meaning in the work or not, whether it is true that Bacon wanted it to be incoherent or not, is kind of irrelevant. Because this way the scholars treat it goes back to the idea of success as a competition. Each scholar is trying to race to solve the problem instead of experiencing the text as it is. They're trying to figure out what Bacon's meaning behind the text was, or what it wasn't, and not just experiencing the text subjectively. The meaning, now that, works can have meanings, the author can have meanings, but the way one understands media and works, and even philosophical and scientific works, has some layer of subjectivity to it, especially a work that is incoherent. So one can try to figure out the meaning, but why? You should just try to experience the work and find a meaning that may be meaningful to you, instead of trying to find this grand ultimate truth, the one truth that all other truths fail in comparison to in terms of the silva. You're not going to be able to do that. The work is incoherent. I cannot stress that enough. But if you just read it and figure out what it means to you, that's different. If you find some grand meaning and that's what it means to you, live with that. If you think the silva is nonsense, live with that too. Don't race to figure out who can put it together first. And even though I know that's what scholarship is, I'm in academia, I'm working on a master's, 2 masters. That's what a lot of academia is. It's a race of success, a race to who can figure out the truth the fastest. And that's why academia always falls behind what people are actually experiencing in the day-to-day. Because academia has given up the importance of experience in favor of the importance of success. Who can publish this first? Who can be the most known scholar of this issue? But finding meaning in the text has robbed some texts of the inherent experience that made some works beautiful to begin with. There is only one thing that makes a dream impossible to achieve: the fear of failure. So this quote comes from my favorite novel, ever, or at least at this point in my life. There's a large possibility my favorite novel might change the more I read. But this novel is called The Alchemist, and I've mentioned The Alchemist before in one of my videos. I believe it was media in relation to the desert, or media in the desert video. But the quote states that the fear of failure is what stops us from achieving our dreams. Not failure itself, mind you, but the fear of failure. The Alchemist is a very complex story with very complex themes and meanings, and each time I read it, I've read it 3 times, I believe, at this point in my life. Each time I read it, it gives me very, very different ideas about life. That's how good it is. But again, The Alchemist is a complex story that follows a main character named Santiago. Santiago has a dream about gold at the base of the pyramids of Giza, the giant pyramids in Egypt, and is convinced by a fortune teller and a mysterious old man to go after the treasure, even though Santiago questions whether it's real or not, or whether it's even possible for him to get from Spain to Egypt. And mind you, this takes place kind of in the, I don't want to call it the Middle Ages, but close. Actually, I'm probably way off. It's a time where technology is very different. Whatever. The time is irrelevant. But on the path, Santiago learns a lot about religion, spirituality, dreams, goals, the nature of desire, and a lot of stuff like that. He meets people of different faiths as he travels through North Africa. He meets people of different backgrounds and from different regions and different cultures. And one of the book's major themes is that dreams are complex but always reachable, in a sense. But yet they don't always happen the way one expects. Because, as the quote states, the only thing that makes a dream impossible is the fear of failure, even if the dream is actively impossible, and I'll explain that later. But when one is chasing a dream, they need to remember that dreams are all about experience, according to the Alchemist at least. It's less about accomplishing them. The Alchemist mentions a bunch of characters who actively can't really accomplish their dreams, but pursue them regardless. And it's when you chase after a dream whether you achieve it or not, you'll end up on the path you're supposed to be on in life. Cosmically. That's what The Alchemist implies. And that's its core theme is, as long as you're chasing your dream, you'll either somehow end up at the dream, or you'll end up on the path you're supposed to be while chasing this dream. So in the context of that, the fear of failure is what holds you back. The fear that one is going to fail in reaching their dreams is what holds them back from everything, not failure itself. Because one is going to fail regardless. But the fear of it is dangerous, according to The Alchemist. The fear of failure causes people to sit and stay where they are. There's a few characters in The Alchemist who fear failure so they don't do anything. There's one character I'm thinking of particularly. And this fear of failure causes people to not try new things, not go to new places, not risk anything, not risk anything. They just exist. And, it all is stemming from this fear that they will lose the competition for success, going back to the very first quote of the video. But if you read The Alchemist, you understand that Santiago fails throughout the whole novel. I would argue Santiago has very few wins in the novel. He is not the most successful main character, and through no fault of his own, just circumstances. But yet, it is The Alchemist who comes and states another very important quote. The fear of suffering is worse than suffering itself. The Alchemist has lots of quotes like that. The Alchemist is a man Santiago meets during his journey, and The Alchemist states this in trying to, again, double down on the idea that, it is fear that messes people up. This fear of suffering is worse than suffering itself. This fear that if I go on this dream and I don't succeed, or that I struggle, or that I suffer to find this dream, that'll be awful. But The Alchemist kind of says, if you just go through the suffering, it's not that bad. But if you fear suffering, you're going to suffer forever and eventually regret not going after what you want. You've prolonged your suffering, essentially. That's the core theme of the Alchemist. The Alchemist, the book, not the Alchemist, the character within the story. The book states that one should just go and experience and try to achieve your dreams. Whether you succeed or not is kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of The Alchemist. The dream is what is relevant. Keeping the dream alive is what is relevant. The dream will manifest regardless if you have the strength to keep believing in it. The novel states that one only strays from the path of their dreams if they're not following the clues dropped or placed by God. Again, the book is very spiritual, very religious, not in the traditional Christian sense. Lots of Muslim, Jewish, agnostic influences. But it essentially implies that, a person is not going to follow their dreams if they're not following their gut feelings. The feeling that God or a cosmic divine being has placed in you and has placed around the world for you to follow. Santiago's dream is not even a dream that can be ranked in success or failure. He's trying to find gold, and sure, I guess he can fail at gold if it's not there, but it's not anything greater than that. He's looking for something, and you can't really fail at looking for something. You can miss it at best. That's not really failure, But, just by looking at it, he experiences so much about the world that he wouldn't have. And The Alchemist, the book, is about experiencing the world, not succeeding. Because, again, Santiago fails constantly in the novel. He gets stolen from so often. He struggles to move forward several times in the story. He stagnates sometimes because he's afraid of failure himself. But eventually he keeps going after usually experiencing something very beautiful about the world around him. And he keeps going because it's about experiencing. Santiago quickly learns that the fear of failure or the desire to succeed does not lead to him succeeding. It holds him back. It's the desire to experience and follow his instincts and intuition is what leads to his dreams being fulfilled. Success and failure are really just social factors and are based on societal values and a lot of other just social factors. And you probably shouldn't be too concerned with them unless you're like an athlete or a competitive like video game player, something, 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 you know. But in your day-to-day life, like if you're a business person or you're just a student, failure and success should not guide you that often, even though they're built into the concepts of society. Like grades is this concept of failure versus success, and love is also often ranked in failure and success, even though those are nonsense. Like, how do you can't rank grades, as we know, are proven not to be a good measure of intelligence. Therefore, they're not a good measure of how successful someone is at thinking to begin with. And yet we force students to abide by this. Same with love. Love can't be put to a standard. You can't really fail at a relationship. You can be awful in a relationship. That's an interpersonal problem. That's not a problem of, failure in a true sense. Like, I guess an interpersonal failure or a personal failing, like a moral failing, it's a different conversation. But people aren't usually thinking about moral failings when they're thinking about failure. They're thinking about competitive failure, or the inability to succeed in a competitive environment. They're not thinking of, I'm a bad person, therefore I have morally failed, I'm morally bankrupt. They're not thinking about that. Anyway, success and failure, you might not want to think about too often. What it means to succeed and what it means to fail kind of vary from society to society, because the winning standards are different, just like from competition to competition in terms of like sports. The rules are different. Societies have different rules for what it means to fail and succeed too. The focus should be on experiencing. Focus on following your dreams, even if they're impossible, because like that's what helps you experience. So let's say your dream is to fly, and you should follow that dream to fly as far as it can take you, and then even further, even though it will be impossible to fly. You will never be able to fly, in theory, but you following that dream will likely take you in places you've never even thought of before, and doing things you never thought of before. Like, let's say your dream is to fly and you end up being a professional skydiver. You ain't really flying, but you're not really falling. Well, I guess you are falling. If you ask me, I wouldn't do that. You're paying to fall, but whatever. Or a professional hang glider, or whatever. That is your dream, to fly. If your dream is to be a great athlete, follow that dream, even if you're past your prime, even if you can't really compete in like the Olympics or like anything that you might perceive to be quote unquote relevant. But, in the search of like your destiny, you'll end up in interesting places. You might end up a really good coach that, creates the next generation of great athletes, or you might, find a different niche or a different athletic need that centers your current body. That's kind of what the Alchemist teaches. That's what Richardson teaches. To me, that's what Bacon's quote implies. We focus on the hits, and we're not really focused on the misses, because the hits kind of add to a greater experience. They all teach that experience is what makes one's life, not success. Success is for social gratification, but experiencing is for the self. You can't take your experiences and give them to someone else. They need to experience that for themselves. But you very much can take your success and give it to someone else. Especially like social successes like wealth and fame. That's what a nepotism baby is. You just take your wealth and fame and you just give it to your child. Like, that's what nepotism is. But you can't do that with experience. And I'm encouraging everyone to experience life in its fullness. And you will fail, quote unquote, because failure is a social thing. But because you will experience the fullness of life, you'll end up where you're supposed to be, in a cosmic sense, or where you want to be, in a normal sense. Because if I haven't made it clear, sure, you'll fail socially, but in the grand scheme of things, failure isn't that real, which is why I put it in quotes. This video is very different from the ones I've made before. It's a lot more esoteric and like complex in a way. I didn't mean for it to be this way. I feel like I said in every video, because none of the videos ever turn out the way I thought they would while I'm like thinking through and researching what I want to research. But you know, when you spend a lot of time like reading and analyzing quotes and essays about success and failure, you start to realize that a lot of people kind of question why success and failure even matter to begin with. And you start to realize people are arguing, whether they know it or not, that accomplishing matters way less than experiencing. And, well, really, this only applies to intellectuals, in a sense, and not to be like an intellectual elitist, but like intellectuals, philosophers, people who are, you know, engaging with sociology and like those types of things. They don't even have to have a formative education. Like, people who are trying to really think through the subject, not grifters who are trying to sell success to people who feel like they're failures. So like, if you listen to someone like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson about success, you're going to be sold an image of success that is centered around that like social idea, you know, of you need to compete to survive, you need to compete to be a noteworthy person, you know. That's the idea that they're selling. I don't read from people, and I do sometimes, you know, not Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, but I don't usually read grifters unless I'm trying to get in the mind of a grifter. Anyway, I suggest everyone read The Alchemist. You know, I super simplified it in this video. The Alchemist is a very, very complex book. I have it right here. It's short-ish. I first read it in high school, was required. Read it again a few times after that. The Alchemist is really, really complex. There's so many nuances, so many complexities in the novel that I didn't even get a chance to mention in this video, nor that they're not even that relevant to the video. The Alchemist probably will one day have its own video. But The Alchemist at its core is about dreams and desires in relation to life. Like, how do we live? What does it mean to live? You know, there's got a lot of that going on. It tackles life from so many different angles because Santiago, again, the main character, meets people of so many different backgrounds. You know, he meets a Muslim man, he meets several Christians. Santiago's implied to like have once been a Christian himself. It's kind of ambiguous whether he still considers himself a Christian. He meets a Roma woman, you know, Roma referring to the Romani people who, you know, usually are Christian, but, you know, practice some, you know, complex ancient practices that are stereotypically depicted in The Alchemist. That is a critique I have. There's some negative depiction of the Romani people that have not aged well. Anyway, you know, Santiago meets all these people. He meets an Englishman who's an agnostic, who studies religion and is trying to, you know, find the truth of the world. Just all these different people who each give him different perspectives on like life, right? And it's magical realism. For those who didn't watch my last video, or maybe it was the video before that, about magic. Magical realism is a genre similar to fantasy in which magic exists, but magic is like a mystery. Like, it's not stated to be magic. It's like just this strange stuff just happens sometimes. I'll do a video on magical realism one day. Anyway, let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments. This is a very strange video that is probably very emotionally charged in many ways. I mean, I straight up argued that failure isn't really that real, even though I know to a certain extent it definitely is, because as I mentioned, there's like moral bankruptcy or moral failings. That is probably more for a Philosophy Friday. Like, most people have never thought about the concept of failing morally, because that is the field of ethics and not regular social failings and successes. Because there's moral failings, but there's no such thing as a moral success. That's just called being a good human. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I appreciate them, and I hope you really try to experience more than accomplish, because that's what matters.